Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Hargrove said to the new nurse 3 days before a child stopped breathing in the hallway. 3 days before everything he built crumbled. He didn't know she was watching him. Not really watching, observing. The way a sniper observes terrain before the shot. Katie Rodriguez arrives at Oak Creek Memorial's pediatric ward at 6:13 a.m. on a Tuesday, 13 minutes before shift change, carrying a canvas bag that contains exactly 2 things, a lunch she won't eat and a cracked ceramic mug that says "World's Best Senior Chief" in letters that have faded to almost nothing. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical drone overhead, that particular frequency that makes time feel slower. The antiseptic smell hits first, bleach mixed with something chemical, something that strips the nasal passages clean. She's been breathing it for 3 days now and her sinuses haven't adjusted. They probably won't. Long sleeves despite the heat. September in Raleigh and the ward keeps its temperature set to 68 degrees because the pediatric patients run fevers. Katie's forearms are wrapped in cotton fabric that clings slightly when she moves, and underneath that fabric are rope burn scars shaped like question marks. Rope from a field hospital in Marjah. The scars are 7 years old, but sometimes when the humidity shifts they ache like they're fresh. She doesn't mention this during the intake interview. She doesn't mention anything about before. Before is buried. Before is a locked footlocker in her studio apartment on Elm Street. Before is a language she no longer speaks except in her sleep. She walks past pediatric Bay 4. Through the observation window she can see Colonel Brennan sitting beside his 8-year-old son's hospital bed. The boy's name is Marcus. Cerebral palsy, mild cognitive delay, recently admitted for respiratory complications that Dr. Hargrove, who runs pediatrics like a man who believes his degree gives him dominion over both medicine and human beings, has deemed manageable without specialist intervention. Katie doesn't need to read the chart to understand what that means. Manageable means expensive procedures can be deferred. Deferred means billing codes remain simple. Simple means profit margins stay clean. The colonel's hands grip the bedside rail. His knuckles are white. Katie can see his son's breathing from 20 feet away, shallow, almost gasping. The kind of breathing that precedes something. Her hands move on their own through the medication organization. Dopamine 400 milliliters. Epinephrine 1 milligram per milliliter. Atropine 0.5 milliliter in the crash cart, arranged precisely the way the Navy taught her, the way that lets fingers find them in the dark, in chaos, when fluorescent lights flicker and time compresses to something smaller than a heartbeat. Muscle memory. That's what the textbooks call it. But muscle memory is a lie. It's not the muscles remembering. It's the brain never forgetting. 7 years of field hospitals don't leave because you change zip codes. 7 years of watching people die from things that shouldn't kill them, from things that could be fixed with equipment that costs less than a car, that doesn't evaporate because you decided to wear scrubs instead of fatigues. The crash cart arranges itself. Endotracheal tubes in sizes 2.5 through 4.0 for the pediatric patients. Laryngoscope blades. Oxygen mask sizes small enough for infants. She's organizing these instruments the way a musician arranges a piano, not just for efficiency but for elegance, for the way her fingers will find them without thinking. Dr. Hargrove walks past the supply room at 7:04 a.m. He pauses. His eyes track the new nurse's movements. The way her hands move. The precision. The speed. The complete absence of wasted motion. This is not how new nurses move. New nurses fumble. New nurses ask questions. New nurses take time to think. Katie feels him pause. She doesn't look up. Looking up would invite conversation. Conversation would invite questions. Questions would invite complications. She continues arranging medication doses on the supply cart, each vial labeled with date, time, concentration, initials. Handwriting that looks like grid coordinates. Numbers that tell a story if you know how to read it. 7 years of field hospital charting. Every drop of blood plasma accounted for. Every unit of morphine documented. Every patient outcome recorded with the precision of someone whose notes might be subpoenaed, might be used in court, might determine whether the people above you kept their jobs or lost everything. Dr. Hargrove does something he doesn't quite do, a half step into the supply room, then a halt. As if something in her posture, something in the economy of her movements, triggered recognition of a category he doesn't have words for. Then he leaves. But before he leaves, Katie hears him breathe. Not speak. Breathe. The kind of breath that precedes calculation. Dr. Hargrove is not a man who thinks about other people's lives. He thinks about other people's billing codes. He thinks about productivity metrics and insurance reimbursement and the way a patient's length of stay directly impacts his departmental efficiency rating and his annual bonus. He is 47 years old and wears a watch that costs more than Katie's annual salary. He has never been wrong about anything important to him, which means he has never truly been tested. He walks into the break room at 7:19 a.m., and the coffee is already made, filtered through one of those expensive machines that grinds beans to order, the kind that smells like possibility. 3 other staff members are present. 2 residents he barely acknowledges and Sarah Chen, a senior nurse with 12 years of experience and the good sense to laugh at his jokes. Sarah is reading something on her phone. One of the residents is scrolling through discharge paperwork. The other is staring into space the way people do when they've been awake for 30 hours straight and their central nervous system is running on fumes and coffee and the fading ghost of whatever dreams they had before medical school hollowed them out. That new nurse, Hargrove says. Not a question. A statement that invites completion. The quiet one. How long do you think she lasts? He's pouring coffee. The stream is thin, precise, the way he does everything, controlled. Intentional. Sarah glances up. She's heard this tone before. Hargrove doesn't like challenges to his authority. He especially doesn't like challenges that manifest as silent competence. Silent competence is harder to bully than loud incompetence. Not sure, doctor, Sarah says carefully. She seems solid. I'll give her a week, Hargrove says. He stirs his coffee. Black. No sugar. No cream. No mercy. Week and a half maximum. These types don't have the temperament for pediatrics. They can't handle the emotional toll. Can't handle that we're working with children. They need the validation. The talking. The discussion of feelings. He's smiling. Not a kind smile. A smile like a predator showing its teeth before the strike. The smile of someone who has never been told no and has therefore concluded that no is not a possible response. 7 days. Who wants to bet? Nobody takes the bet. Not immediately. Sarah's eyes dart to her phone, hoping for a page that will remove her from this conversation. The residents stare at their respective tasks with the intensity of people trying to become invisible. But Hargrove's confidence is a weapon like any other weapon. It pushes. It tests. It waits for agreement. Finally, one of the residents, the younger one, maybe 3rd year, still soft around the edges, says quietly, 10 days. I think she'll last 10 days. Done, Hargrove says. He puts the coffee down. It leaves a ring on the institutional white countertop, a brown stain shaped like a question mark. 10 days. Loser buys lunch. He walks out of the break room at 7:23 a.m., and the silence that follows is the kind of silence that happens when someone just predicts the future and no one present has the power to stop it. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next changed everything. Katie is at the medication cart when the intercom crackles at 7:31 a.m. The sound cuts through the pediatric ward like electricity through wet skin. Static. Then a voice. Page for Dr. Hargrove. Trauma Bay 3. She doesn't move. The other nurses move. They scramble toward emergency protocols, toward the adrenaline spike that comes when the word trauma enters the space. But Katie stands perfectly still, one hand on the crash cart, because she's heard that tone before. The tone that precedes something. The tone of seconds running out. Her locker sits on the bottom shelf of the break room closet. Someone left a pair of combat boots there sometime last week, scuffed brown leather, laces wrapped around the ankles the way soldiers wrap them. Army issue. Probably belongs to someone's relative. She's been meaning to turn them into lost and found. The boots remind her of things. The way something smells. The way sand gets into everything despite careful maintenance. The way your hands shake the first time you open a tourniquet kit and realize you have approximately 90 seconds to stop someone from bleeding out. She should have turned them in. She should have walked past them every morning without seeing them. She should have done a lot of things differently. But Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez learned long ago that should is a luxury that only people with safe futures get to indulge. She closes the crash cart in one smooth motion. The sound it makes is a soft metallic click, equipment secure, ready, waiting. She walks toward Trauma Bay 3. The Trauma Bay doors slide open with a pneumatic hiss, and Katie's hands move on their own. Sterile field. Gloved fingers. The young patient, maybe 16, motorcycle versus delivery truck, bleeds from a laceration above the left clavicle, and the traveling medic from Seattle General arrives in scrubs still wet from the pre-op wash. They work without names. Just movement. Just competence. Katie reaches for the 4.0 silk suture, and the medic, a man with sergeant's bearing and scarred knuckles, guides the needle through tissue with a precision that makes her pause. The stitch is perfect. Methodical. The kind of running stitch you only learned under fire, when stopping meant watching someone die. She has seen that stitch before. In Marjah. The medic's hands freeze mid-loop. His eyes meet hers across the surgical field, and something shifts in his expression, recognition, maybe. Disbelief. He leans closer, voice barely a whisper against the ventilator's wheeze. That's a Kandahar running stitch. Where did you serve? Katie's hands pause for half a heartbeat. 1. 2. The monitor beeps its steady rhythm. The fluorescent lights hum overhead like they are interrogating her. She finishes the stitch without breaking focus. I don't know what you mean. Her voice is flat. The kind of flat that comes from practice. From 2 years of being invisible. From nights in her apartment staring at a photograph of 17 faces, only 9 of whom came home. The medic's mouth opens, then closes. He doesn't ask again. He finishes the closure in silence, and Katie backs away from the table with measured steps, not running, never running, and scrubs out alone. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead. Someone drops an instrument tray in the hallway. The sound is like gunfire. She doesn't flinch. Earlier that afternoon, the cafeteria smelled like something between chicken and institutional apology. Katie carried her tray, soup, salad, a roll she wouldn't eat, toward the back corner where 3 nurses from the ICU sat comparing notes on a patient with septic shock. The conversation stopped when she approached. These are Hargrove's residents, which means they watch what they say around anyone he hasn't approved. She had just turned toward the empty table when Hargrove appeared from behind the beverage station. He was carrying his own tray, moving with the casual purpose of a man who had never been told no. His elbow caught her tray from the left side, and hot soup exploded across her scrubs, down her front, soaking the fabric, the heat immediate and inescapable. "Oh, God, I'm sorry," he said, and he was not sorry at all. His smile had teeth in it. "Didn't see you there, sweetheart." Laughter erupted from his table. A resident spilled coffee. Another one tried to hide it behind his hand. Hargrove stood there, tray intact, watching her with an expression like a predator waiting to see if the prey would break. Katie set down her tray on the nearest table. The remaining soup sloshed, but the bowl didn't fall. She looked at Hargrove once, just once, and walked toward the bathroom. Her face was expressionless. Her neck, though, flushed red with something that might have been anger or might have been something deeper, the rage of someone who had held a field hospital together for 18 hours under siege and would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She cleaned the soup from her scrubs with paper towels and cold water. Her hands did not shake. She changed into her backup set, she always kept a backup, and returned to the pediatric ward 20 minutes later as if nothing had happened. Hargrove was waiting during afternoon rounds. The colonel's son lay in the bed, a cerebral palsy patient with a mother sitting at his bedside reading a picture book out loud. The child was 8, maybe 9, with eyes that followed Hargrove with the careful attention of someone who had learned to be afraid of doctors. Hargrove pulled the chart from the holder and reviewed it with the kind of attention he usually reserved for golf handicaps, not really paying attention at all. Then he closed the chart and threw it at Katie's feet. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Since you're so interested in questioning my treatment plans." The pages scattered across the linoleum floor like autumn leaves. Katie heard the child gasp. She heard the mother's breath catch. She heard the soft sound of Hargrove's satisfaction, thick and poisonous as anesthesia gas. Katie kneeled slowly. Her knees cracked against the hard floor. She gathered each page methodically, in order, creating order from chaos because order was what she had always done. Her hand stayed steady. She could feel Hargrove watching, waiting for her to explode or cry or shrink further into the background. Instead, she stood up. She held the chart at her side. And when she looked at him, her eyes were the color of a Helm and Province winter sky, pale and merciless. "The father asked about the specialist referral you noted 2 weeks ago," she said quietly. "I told him I'd check on the status." Hargrove's smile vanished. Not because she had been insubordinate. Not because she had challenged him in front of a patient. But because she had done exactly what he feared, noticed something. Asked something. Become the kind of person who could not be humiliated into compliance. He walked away without another word. Katie handed the chart back to Colonel Brennan, who had risen slightly from his chair, his face tight with fury that had nothing to do with his son's diagnosis and everything to do with watching a nurse be degraded in front of his family. He was a green beret. Katie could see it in how he moved, in the careful control in his shoulders, in the way his hand came up to rest on his son's forehead as if touch alone could protect him. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she left. The emergency surgery came at 8 p.m., admitting a 17-year-old with a traumatic pneumothorax from a motorcycle accident on Route 40. The trauma team assembled in minutes, the attending surgeon from Chapel Hill, the anesthesiologist from the night shift, the traveling medic from Seattle General who had arrived that morning for a clinical rotation. Katie prepped the bay. 14-gauge angiocath needles lined up like soldiers. Sterile field marked with precise borders. The ventilator settings ready, the Reboa balloon catheter laid out just in case, the room arranged so that every instrument was exactly where hands would find it in the dark. The patient arrived on the ambulance stretcher, and the room moved like something choreographed. The anesthesiologist intubated. The surgeon opened the left anterolateral thoracotomy with a scalpel that moved like it had a mind of its own. Katie handed instruments before requests were made. Her hands knew what came next. Her eyes tracked the vital signs, BP dropping, O2 sat falling, heart rate climbing. The traveling medic arrived in clean scrubs and moved to the surgical field to assist with wound closure. That was when Katie reached for the silk suture, and her hands moved through the Kandahar running stitch, the one that holds under pressure when standard technique fails, the one that becomes second nature after you have used it to close wounds in a field hospital with artillery landing 300 meters away. The medic's hands froze. His eyes found hers across the surgical field, and something shattered in his expression, not shock exactly, but a kind of vertical recognition, the way you recognize a voice you thought was gone forever. He whispered so quietly that only Katie could hear, "That's a Kandahar running stitch." "Where did you serve?" Katie's hands paused. Just for half a heartbeat. 1 count. 2. Her mind catalogued the choice, answer or deflect. Honor or invisibility. Tell the truth and invite the question that would spiral into others, or maintain the fiction she had constructed so carefully that even she sometimes believed it. She finished the stitch. "I don't know what you mean," she said, and her voice was steady as surgical steel. The medic opened his mouth. Katie felt the weight of what he wanted to ask, the names of units, the dates of deployment, the specific firefight where that stitch had saved someone's life. Instead, he closed his mouth and returned to the closure without another word. The room went back to its work. The monitor beeped. The fluorescent lights hummed. The ventilator wheezed like it was breathing for both of them, the patient and Katie's past. When the surgery was finished, she stepped back from the table with measured movements, stripped her gloves, and walked to the scrub sink alone. The water ran hot and smelled like institutional soap. She watched her hands move under the stream, competent hands, scarred hands, hands that had held lives together and would never be thanked for it. Outside, rain hammered the hospital windows like applause no one had asked for. Katie turned off the water and walked back to the pediatric ward, where Hargrove was still waiting. But that wasn't the worst part yet. The night shift held the kind of silence that made thinking dangerous. Katie sat at the nurse's station on the third floor of Oak Creek Memorial, the glow of the computer screen casting everything in that flat, institutional blue that made 11 p.m. feel like 3 a.m. The ward was quiet. Most rooms dark. Most children sleeping the medicated sleep of pain management and exhaustion. She wasn't supposed to be reviewing billing records. That wasn't her job. That wasn't any nurse's job. But she'd been charting and for insertion on Colonel Brennan's 8-year-old son, Thomas, though everyone called him TJ, when she noticed something that made her fingers stop moving across the keyboard. The charges didn't match the care. Katie opened another tab. Then another. Insurance codes for specialist consultations that she herself had never seen documented in the medical record. Neurology, $2,400. Orthopedic surgery, $1,800. Pulmonology, $2,200. Each one billed to a different specialist, each one supposedly authorizing complex interventions for the boy's cerebral palsy. She knew the file. She'd been assigned to TJ 3 times this week. There had been no neurologist visits. No orthopedic assessments. The pulmonologist she'd seen was. Katie pulled up the name from the billing code. Dr. Marcus Webb, pulmonology consultation, coded for 45 minutes of direct patient care. She checked the medical record. Dr. Webb had never charted a single note. Never documented an examination. Never so much as reviewed the boy's imaging. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Katie's jaw tightened. She'd seen billing fraud before, once, in a field hospital outside San Juan Valley, when supply sergeants inflated casualty counts to justify requesting additional medical equipment they could sell on the black market. It had been corrected. It had been reported. That had been her world, where rule-breaking got you court-martialed. This was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be civilian. This was supposed to be clean. She opened the full billing history. Phantom consultations going back 8 months. Specialist referrals that never happened. Procedure codes for interventions that were never authorized, never discussed, never performed. The pattern was clean, methodical, almost elegant in its systematic extraction of insurance money. Someone with deep access to the billing system had built this carefully. Someone who understood exactly which codes would be accepted, which amounts would slip through automated approval systems, which documentation gaps would be overlooked by insurers processing thousands of claims daily. Katie's hands moved on their own muscle memory, opening new tabs, cross-referencing charts, building the timeline. Her training asserted itself, not combat training, but something older in her bones. The ability to see patterns in chaos. The ability to recognize when a system was being exploited by someone who believed they wouldn't be caught. TJ had cerebral palsy. Spastic diplegia, according to his initial admission notes. He could walk with assistance. His speech was clear. His cognition was sharp. But his muscle tone was compromised, his balance unstable, and his breathing sometimes shallow, compensation patterns that could lead to complications if they weren't addressed proactively. He needed what the chart said he was getting: specialized assessments, targeted interventions, maybe botulinum injections to manage spasticity, maybe orthodontic bracing, maybe pulmonary function testing to assess his respiratory capacity. TJ was supposed to be getting that care. Instead, someone was billing for it while doing nothing. Katie printed the documentation. 47 pages. She folded them carefully and slid them into the inside pocket of her scrub jacket. The paper was thin, almost delicate. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Easy to hide if you needed to. The hallway was empty when she finished. Just the sound of distant monitors, the hum of the fax system cycling through filters, the occasional beep of an 4-pump in one of the patient rooms. She walked back toward the pediatric ward, her shoes silent on the linoleum, her mind running through scenarios the way it had in Marjah when the radio crackled with intelligence that didn't match the ground truth. Colonel Brennan was in the hallway outside TJ's room when Katie emerged from the stairwell. She knew him by sight now, the way his uniform fit him like someone who'd worn it for 30 years, the way he stood with his shoulders squared as if his body still obeyed military bearing even when his mind was exhausted with worry. He was talking to Dr. Hargrove. She could hear the warmth in Hargrove's voice from 20 feet away. That practiced, deliberate warmth that made you want to believe him. Made you feel like he was the only person in the world who truly understood your child's condition. These specialty referrals take time to authorize, Colonel, Hargrove was saying, his hand on Brennan's shoulder with the casual familiarity of someone accustomed to being trusted immediately. Insurance companies scrutinize everything. Your son is stable. We're monitoring him closely. The paperwork is moving through the system. Katie felt her jaw clench. She'd seen that hand placement before, on soldiers, on civilians, on people who needed to believe in something because the alternative was unbearable. Hargrove's eyes flicked toward her. A glance, nothing more. But it was a message. A warning encoded in the language of institutional power. He knew she'd been looking at something. He knew her too well already, or rather, he'd underestimated her too completely, which amounted to the same thing. Colonel Brennan nodded. He wanted to believe. You could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed, the way the exhaustion lines around his eyes softened. A Green Beret who'd faced ambushes and insurgencies and the weight of command, rendered completely vulnerable by his son's fragile body. Katie opened her mouth. Nurse Rodriguez, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the particular authority that made it clear he wasn't making a request. A word, please. The supply room was 3 doors down. Industrial shelves lined every wall, sterile gauze packs, for solutions, cardiac monitor cables, pediatric endotracheal tubes in descending sizes. The air smelled of antiseptic and plastic storage bins. Hargrove closed the door behind them with the kind of quiet finality that made the space feel suddenly smaller. You're reassigned, he said without preamble. Off the Brennan case. Effective immediately. Katie's voice remained level. That child needs specialist evaluation. That child needs nurses who follow orders and don't create paranoid conspiracy theories for worried parents. Hargrove stepped closer, his posture shifting into something predatory, something that revealed he'd been waiting for this moment. I've noticed your personnel file is remarkably thin. No references beyond a community clinic. It would be unfortunate if HR began asking questions about gaps in your employment history. He was good at this. The implicit threat wrapped in bureaucratic language. The way he'd found her pressure point, not her competence, which couldn't be questioned, but her past, which she'd buried so carefully that its absence was conspicuous. Katie's hand moved to the documents in her jacket pocket. She could show him. She could spread the 47 pages across the shelving unit and walk him through every phantom consultation, every billed procedure, every specialist who'd never seen the patient. She could present it like evidence, like a briefing, like something that demanded accountability. But he was right about one thing. Her file was thin. Her presence at Oak Creek Memorial was barely 6 days old. She had no institutional allies, no tenure, no network of colleagues who'd vouch for her integrity over a senior physician's reputation. In this place, in this system, he had more power than she did. Not because he was smarter. Because he'd been here longer. Because the hospital needed his reputation. Because no one asked questions about the nurse who'd appeared out of nowhere without a background, without references, without the kind of professional history that made people feel safe. She turned and walked out of the supply room without answering. Her hand was steady. Her breathing was steady. Her face was the blank, professional mask she'd perfected over 13 years of field medicine. The trembling, if there was trembling, was something only her hands could feel, pressed against her thighs. She didn't go back to TJ's floor immediately. Instead, she went to the records room on the second level, where the paper charts were stored in climate-controlled filing systems. The room was empty at 11:56 p.m. Just Katie and the hum of the climate control unit working to preserve medical history at precisely 68 degrees. She pulled TJ's original intake file from the month he'd been admitted to Oak Creek Memorial for evaluation of his cerebral palsy progression. August. 7 months ago. The chart showed his initial assessment, normal vital signs, clear cognitive function, mild spasticity in bilateral lower extremities, some respiratory compensation patterns noted by the admitting physician, underlined, flagged, marked for follow-up pulmonary assessment. The follow-up had been coded in Hargrove's billing system. It had never happened. Katie photographed each page with her phone. Not to use them, not yet, maybe not ever. But to have them. To hold the proof of what she'd seen. The documents in her jacket pocket were sufficient, but this was insurance. This was building a case the way you built a survival strategy in hostile territory, layer by layer, backup after backup, assuming nothing would be believed until everything was documented. Back on the pediatric floor, she charted TJ's vitals from the automatic monitoring system. His oxygen saturation was 94%. Normal for a child with his condition, though borderline. His heart rate was elevated, 104 beats per minute, consistent with the agitation Hargrove had noted during his examination. A child who sensed the adults around him were concerned. A child who'd probably heard his parents' fear transmitted through their breathing, through the tension in their voices when they thought he was asleep. Katie pulled up the medication orders. There it was. Hargrove had written it in while she was in the supply room. Chlorpromazine, 0.5 milligrams per kilogram body weight, for anxiety and agitation. A sedative that would calm TJ. A sedative that would also suppress his respiratory drive. The order was flagged for pharmacy approval. It would arrive in 15 minutes. Maybe 20 if the night pharmacist was busy. Maybe less. Katie's phone showed 11:52 p.m. She opened her jacket pocket and felt the folded documents against her ribs. In Marjah, when intelligence came through that didn't match the ground, when orders came from command that contradicted what you could see with your eyes, you had to make a choice. Follow protocol and hope the system worked. Or act on what you knew, consequences be damned. She'd served 13 years under that weight. She'd chosen to trust the system. She'd held that line because removing the line meant removing everything she believed in. But this wasn't a military decision anymore. This wasn't about chain of command or rules of engagement. This was about a child whose father had worn the same uniform she had. A child who couldn't speak for himself. A child who was being systematically abandoned by the doctor whose job was to save him. She thought of her platoon, half of them gone. The ones who'd come home wrong. The one she'd failed to keep alive in a field hospital in Helmand Province because she'd followed protocol while her commander bled out on a stretcher. Katie's hand hovered over her keyboard. She could document this. She could create a chart note flagging the medication order as contraindicated for a pediatric patient with compromised respiratory status. She could cite the pulmonary assessment that should have been done but wasn't. She could raise the alarm through channels. She could also be fired for it. Could have her thin file scrutinized. Could disappear from Oak Creek Memorial the way she'd disappeared from the Navy, quietly, without explanation, with more questions than answers. The pharmacy was loading TJ's medication right now. She could see the digital queue on the system. 3 orders ahead of his. Katie didn't move. Not yet. She sat very still, her fingers resting on the keyboard, her eyes tracking the medication cue as it processed. The sounds of the night ward continued around her, monitors beeping, a distant voice from the call light, the ice machine in the break room cycling through its freeze cycle with a sound like distant thunder. She touched the photograph in her pocket. Marjah, 2011. 18 personnel in the photo. 6 of them dead. 6 others who'd come home with invisible wounds that no medical system could address. And Captain Marcus Chen, who'd led them all, whose face was barely visible in the corner because he'd been turned away when the photo was taken, already thinking about something none of them had seen coming. The medication order entered the pharmacy queue at 11:33 a.m. Katie watched it process, knowing Hargrove's rejection was already written in invisible ink. She turned from the computer terminal and moved toward the pediatric ward's main corridor, her scrub still damp from the morning's simulated codes, when she heard it, the sound of a child struggling to breathe. It came from room 412. Katie's footsteps quickened without permission from her rational mind, muscle memory overriding the careful anonymity she'd maintained for 3 days. The door was half open. Colonel Brennan sat beside his 8-year-old son, Marcus, whose small chest was heaving in a pattern that made Katie's blood go cold. Asymmetrical. One side rising higher than the other. The boy's lips were taking on a bluish tint around the edges. Hargrove stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching like a spectator at an autopsy. Nurse Rodriguez, you are not assigned to. Katie was already moving. She didn't acknowledge him. The crash cart was 3 doors down. She brought it back in 8 seconds, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this before oxygen became optional. The boy's eyes were wide with panic, his small fingers clutching at his hospital gown. Marcus, I need you to stay very still for me, Katie said, her voice dropping to the exact frequency that cut through fear. Not soothing. Commanding. Your daddy's right here. You're going to feel a little pinch and then you're going to breathe better. Can you do that? The boy nodded, his trust absolute. Katie palpated his ribs with her fingertips, counting, 2, 3, finding the second intercostal space where the needle would go. She opened the decompression kit with one hand while her other steadied the boy's chest. The needle was 14 gauge, spring-loaded, ready. What are you doing? Hargrove's voice had risen an octave. You need authorization for any procedure. You need the attending physician. This is protocol. The protocol is that he dies in 2 minutes without this, Katie said flatly. She didn't look up. She inserted the needle between the ribs, felt the resistance of tissue and then the hiss of air escaping. The sound of compressed lung finding freedom. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Marcus's chest expanded on both sides now. His color began returning from gray to something closer to human. His breathing deepened, no longer the desperate gasp of a drowning child. The entire intervention had taken 42 seconds. His oxygen saturation climbed on the monitor beside his bed, 78, 82, 87, 91. Colonel Brennan stood frozen, his hand over his mouth. He was looking at Katie's hands with the expression of a man watching someone return from the dead. His son was alive because of the steady woman he'd barely noticed 3 days ago. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old brick. He opened his mouth, closed it, then backed out of the room without another word. Katie secured the needle with tape and checked the boy's bilateral breath sounds with her stethoscope. Both sides clear. She reached over and squeezed Marcus's shoulder once, and he managed a weak smile before exhaustion and relief took over and his eyes fluttered closed. She turned to Colonel Brennan, and for just a moment, their eyes met. She saw recognition there, not of her face, but of her competence. Of her authority. Of something he couldn't quite place. He'll need a chest X-ray to confirm resolution, Katie said quietly. But his saturation is stable. His breathing is normalized. What you just did, Brennan said slowly, I've only seen that done once before. In a field hospital. Katie was already walking out of the room. I'll let the attending know about the status change. She didn't run. She didn't allow the adrenaline spike to show in her gait. She moved like a professional nurse who'd handled a crisis, nothing more. But her hands, when she finally let them rest on the medication cart in the supply room, were shaking with something that wasn't fear. It was rage. She'd crossed a line. She'd stepped out of invisibility and into the light, and Hargrove had watched every second of it. He'd seen her competence. He'd seen her authority. He'd seen the training that no regular civilian nurse possessed. He'd seen her as a threat that could no longer be dismissed with condescension. By 1:15 p.m., Hargrove was in his office with the door closed, phone pressed to his ear. Katie didn't know this yet. She was still making rounds, still checking vitals, still moving through the afternoon with her head slightly down. But word traveled through institutional hierarchies like blood through veins. By 2:48 p.m., she heard through the ward clerk that Dr. Hargrove had called the chief of medical staff. By 3:15 p.m., he'd made contact with 2 board members. By 4:22 p.m., he'd reached a third. The conversations were remarkably similar. Unauthorized procedures. Insubordination. Possible credential fraud. The nurse was dangerous, unhinged, operating outside her scope of practice. She'd endangered a patient by performing a procedure reserved for physicians. Yes, the child was fine, but that wasn't the point. The point was the breach of protocol. The point was liability. Hargrove also made a call to Community Health Clinic in Charlotte, the only facility that appeared on Katie's employment history. He spoke to the director of HR, a woman who'd already retired twice and had no memory of Katie Rodriguez, but he was very persuasive. He explained that Katie claimed to have worked there for 2 years, but they had no record. He expressed concern that credentials might have been falsified. Very serious, he said. Very concerning for patient safety. The director promised to send copies of their employee records for verification purposes, which would take 6 to 8 weeks. By 4:45 p.m., Hargrove had contacted an outside HR investigator from a firm called Diligent Compliance Solutions. The investigator was experienced in credential fraud cases. The investigator asked for specific concerns. Hargrove provided them, his voice carrying the weight of a man protecting his institution. And at 5:20 p.m., Katie was called to the administrative office. She knew it was over before she saw the folder on the desk. The administrator, a man named Jeffrey Pierce whose father had donated the entire East Wing, was sitting behind mahogany that probably cost more than Katie's annual salary. He didn't make eye contact. He opened the folder and slid a typed letter across the desk without touching it, as if the paper itself might be contaminated. Pending investigation into credential irregularities and scope of practice violations, we are placing you on immediate leave, effective immediately. Paid suspension until the investigation concludes. You'll surrender your badge and building access. Security will escort you from the premises. Katie read the letter once. Her eyes tracked across the words, investigation, fraud, unauthorized, termination, but they didn't land. She folded it carefully and set it back on the desk. Do you have any statement? Pierce asked. She could explain. She could pull up the Navy database on a government website that was still accessible through her dormant military email, the one she'd never deleted. She could show her DD-214, her discharge papers, her entire service record. She could call a number that still worked, a direct line to a woman in Arlington who would confirm everything. But Katie had walked away from that life without telling a single person. Not her sister. Not her closest friend. Not the therapist at the VA who'd advised against sudden isolation. She'd left the Navy off her applications, filled in the Charlotte Clinic experience instead because it was the smallest lie she could construct. She'd built a life on anonymity, on the principle that if no one knew what she was, no one could ask her to be it again. Explaining would destroy that invisibility completely. No statement, Katie said. She stood up, and Pierce flinched slightly at the movement, as if he'd expected her to argue or cry or threaten. She did none of those things. She nodded once and walked out of his office. Security escorted her to her locker. She removed the small personal items she'd brought, a cracked mug with an anchor insignia that was half scraped off from a previous attempt to erase it, a dying succulent that no amount of afternoon sunlight could revive, and a photograph from Marjah, 2014. It showed her and 7 others, all in combat fatigues, all with their arms around each other's shoulders. 6 of them had come home with invisible wounds that no medical system could address. 2 had not come home at all. She placed them in a cardboard box and left Oak Creek Memorial at 5:36 p.m. The rain started before she reached the bus stop, the kind of rain that felt personal, that fell with purpose. Her scrubs were still damp underneath her jacket. Her hair clung to her neck. She stood at the shelter on Fayetteville Street with her box pressed against her chest, watching the rain hammer the asphalt in a rhythm that sounded like automatic fire if you'd heard enough of it. A car pulled up to the curb, its tires hissing against wet pavement. Colonel Brennan lowered the window. He was alone, and he was holding something. Katie couldn't see what, not clearly, but the shape was familiar, leather-worn soft, laces frayed from decades of use, the particular slouch of boots that had walked through deserts and carried their owner through things that changed your cellular structure. "Get in," he said simply. Katie didn't move. "I found these in the staff room this morning," Brennan continued, holding up the boots. They were combat boots, the kind you issued to people who'd earned them. The kind you recognized even after years. Someone mentioned they might be yours. Someone also mentioned you just got suspended. I overheard Dr. Pierce on the phone with his insurance company. Seemed pretty panicked about liability. "Sir, I can't." "That's not a request, Nurse Rodriguez." Something in the way he said it, the authority, the certainty, the refusal to accept refusal, broke through Katie's carefully constructed walls. She got in the car. She set the box on her lap and watched the boots through the windshield. Colonel Brennan drove in silence for several blocks, the wipers keeping rhythm with her heartbeat. "My son asked about you while he was sleeping," Brennan said finally. He said that Nurse was scared, but she didn't let the scare be bigger than what she needed to do. 8 years old, and he understood something most adults never figure out. Katie didn't respond. She was holding the box so tightly the cardboard was beginning to crimp. "I was in the army," Brennan continued. "Green berets, same as my father. I recognize the way someone moves when they've been trained to survive. I recognize the way someone makes decisions in crisis. That's not civilian training. That's not something you pick up at a community college." "You don't know anything about me," Katie said quietly. "No," Brennan agreed. "But I know what you did. I watched you save my son's life without hesitation or authorization or concern for your own career. That's all the resume I need." He pulled the car into the parking lot of an extended stay motel, the kind with weekly rates and a sympathetic manager who didn't ask questions. He handed her the combat boots across the seats. "Stay here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, we figure out what comes next. Because I promise you, Dr. Hargrove's investigation is about to become very interesting. And you're going to want to be available to answer questions." Katie took the boots. They were warm, as if Brennan had been holding them close. She could smell the leather, the faint tang of oil, the ghost of desert dust that no amount of cleaning could completely remove. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because," Brennan said, "you didn't hesitate. You saw my son dying, and you didn't think about yourself for even 1 second. That's not something you can fake. That's not something that comes from anywhere except from having already sacrificed everything once." He left her with a room key and a phone number. Katie sat on the bed in room 247 with the box beside her and the boots in her hands, understanding that her life, carefully constructed on the foundation of invisibility, was about to become very visible indeed. The box sat on the bed in room 247, and Katie stared at it like it contained something radioactive. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the precise tremor of someone who had held that composure so long it was now vibrating at a frequency only her body could feel. She'd been terminated at 3:16 p.m. The paperwork was signed by an HR investigator she'd never met, citing falsified credentials, insufficient references, and a recommendation from Dr. Hargrove that she represented a liability to patient care. The words were surgical, professional, a knife made of policy and procedure. She hadn't defended herself. There was nothing to defend. The truth, her true identity, her decorations, her 12 years of field medicine in places where the only anesthesia was adrenaline and necessity, was sealed in a Pentagon file that she'd walked away from without telling anyone. Not her sister in Seattle. Not her commanding officer. Not even the chaplain who'd tried to reach her 3 times after Marjah. She'd simply stopped answering the phone and started pushing a mop at a hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, where nobody knew her name and nobody would ever ask what she'd seen. The cracked mug sat in the box with newspaper padding around it. It had come from the hospital's employee gift shop, $5, ceramic with a faded navy anchor that was barely visible anymore. She'd bought it on her first day, thinking it might ground her somehow. The dying succulent was from Mrs. Chen in room 314, who'd thrust it into Katie's hands yesterday with tears streaming down her face. "You saved my grandson," Mrs. Chen had said. Katie had said nothing. She'd accepted the plant the way she accepted most kindness, with a nod and a slight pressure on the wrist. The photograph came last. 8 people in desert fatigues, standing in front of a field hospital constructed from tents and determination. The photo was taken in Marjah in 2017. 4 of the people in that photograph were not alive anymore. She knew where each of them had been buried, because she'd been the one holding their hands when it mattered most. Katie picked up the boots Colonel Brennan had left her. They were worn the way combat boots become worn, the leather creased and soft from 10,000 miles of walking through terrain that wanted to kill you. She ran her thumb across the sole. Sand still embedded in the grooves. This man had stood beside her in the hallway, holding his son's hand, watching her work without blinking, and at the end he'd said nothing except, "I know who you are." Then he'd left the boots and a room key and a phone number on a napkin. The rain hammered Oak Creek Memorial's windows with the sound of artillery. Katie pressed her forehead against the glass and watched the parking lot blur into abstraction. She'd spent 12 years being invisible. She'd spent the last month being visible to exactly the wrong person. And now she was unemployed, homeless, and about to become a lot more visible whether she wanted to or not. What she didn't know was that the FBI had been investigating Oak Creek Memorial for 3 months. 2 federal agents stepped off the elevator on the administrative floor at 6:23 p.m. that same evening, their credentials clipped to their belts like weapons. Agent Sarah Mitchell and Agent Robert Castellano had been tracking phantom consultations and inflated procedure codes across pediatric departments in 3 states. An anonymous tip, a voice-recorded message left at the FBI field office in Charlotte, had pointed them to Dr. Hargrove specifically. The tip included dates, procedure codes, and billing amounts. It included the names of patients who'd been charged for specialist consultations that never occurred. It included one 8-year-old boy named Marcus Brennan who'd been billed $47,000 for imaginary cardiology, orthopedic, and neurology visits over 6 months. They requested Hargrove's personnel file and his direct access to the hospital billing system. The IT director, a woman named Patricia who'd been terrified of Hargrove for 8 years, opened his computer logs without hesitation. What they found made her stomach drop. At 11:27 p.m. the previous night, exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes after a code blew in the pediatric hallway that had ended with an emergency needle decompression and a child breathing again, Dr. Hargrove had accessed Katie's employment records and altered them. Her credentials had been changed from a verified Navy nurse corps to unverified, credential documentation pending. Her references had been flagged as insufficient. Her hire date had been moved forward by 18 months, suggesting she'd been at the hospital longer than she actually was, which created the false appearance of documentation errors. The timestamp was digital and immutable. Hargrove had done this in the dark, at nearly midnight, panicking. The agents exchanged a look that said everything. A man doesn't forge an employee's records unless he's terrified of what that employee knows. Mitchell pulled up the billing records while Castellano reviewed the communications. What emerged was a system of calculated exploitation. Hargrove had sent emails to the billing department with explicit instructions, maximize CP codes for all cerebral palsy patients. These families never question complexity charges. CP codes were the most expensive. They triggered automatic specialist referrals that drove costs into the stratosphere. Families desperate for their children to get better didn't ask questions. They just signed the forms and went home wondering how they'd ever pay the bill. Colonel Marcus Brennan's file showed 73 itemized charges over 6 months. 73. Castellano had been a Marine before he became an FBI agent, and his jaw clenched in a way that suggested he was thinking about what he'd like to do to Hargrove with his bare hands. Most of the consultations were ghosts. The agents called the specialists listed on the forms. None of them had seen Marcus Brennan. The hospital had no records of these consultations. But the insurance companies had paid $47,328, to be exact, directly to a shell company registered to a man named Robert Hargrove, the doctor's brother-in-law, an LLC that existed for no other purpose than to receive money that wasn't being earned. The network unraveled like cheap fabric. 2 of the board members Hargrove had called in favors from yesterday were already under federal investigation for the same scheme at a sister hospital in South Carolina. His collaborators weren't loyal friends. They were co-conspirators who'd dump him the moment the pressure increased. The billing director who'd written the codes was in her 20s and terrified. She'd been told that's how pediatric billing worked. She'd been told Dr. Hargrove was brilliant and she was just following procedure. By 7:15 p.m., she'd given up every email, every instruction, every meeting note. The outside HR investigator Hargrove had brought in was named David Townsend, a consultant with a reputation for thorough documentation. When Agent Mitchell called him directly at 7:40 p.m. and asked him to produce Katie's employment file along with all communications he'd had with Dr. Hargrove, Townsend's voice went careful and quiet. He was a professional. He understood the implications of what he was being asked. He brought the file to the hospital himself 15 minutes later, handed it to Mitchell with both hands, and said, "I was hired to terminate her. I didn't know why." He said she was a security risk. She was not a security risk. The file was thin. 3 weeks of employment. Meticulous charting. Peer reviews from nurses calling her exceptionally competent and calm under pressure. A note from the traveling combat medic, "This nurse has advanced field experience. Recommend immediate consideration for trauma rotation." And a note from Dr. Hargrove marked confidential, "This employee has become a problem. Recommend immediate termination before she can access further patient files." Mitchell opened the sealed naval personnel records, which she could do because this was now a federal investigation and Catherine Elena Rodriguez was not a civilian anymore. Not in any file that mattered. The records opened like a door into another life. Senior Chief Petty Officer. 12 years active duty. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Marjah deployment, 2017. Command of FOB Shank Medical Operations, 2018. Nurse Corps Commendations. Combat Lifesaver Certification above the standard. A Purple Heart. Another Purple Heart. And a Navy Cross citation for extraordinary heroism while engaged in armed conflict. 18 hours under siege. Never leaving the patients. Never leaving the post. The investigator Townsend was still standing in the hallway, watching Mitchell read. His face had gone very still. "That's who you tried to get me to fire," he said to nobody in particular. "You asked me to terminate a decorated war hero to cover billing fraud." Dr. Hargrove was arrested at 8:03 p.m. in the hospital atrium, handcuffed with mechanical precision, his wrists pressed together while someone read him his rights. The sound of the handcuff latch closing was like the sound of a door locking behind him. Staff stopped what they were doing. Visitors stopped walking. The atrium went quiet except for the hiss of the automatic doors and the crackle of radio dispatch somewhere in the distance. 2 officers led him past the break room where he'd made his bet about Katie quitting. Past the cafeteria where he'd knocked her tray into her lap. Past the hallway where he'd thrown a chart at her feet. Colonel Brennan was standing near the pediatric ward entrance with his son, and he watched Hargrove pass without expression. The boy didn't look away. Neither did the man. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old bone. He was booked on federal fraud charges, falsification of medical records, wire fraud, and conspiracy. His medical license was suspended within 48 hours pending a board investigation. The hospital issued a statement apologizing to families for billing errors spanning 18 months. 11 other pediatric cases were flagged for full financial audit. The insurance companies announced they would be investigating all claims processed through Hargrove's department. His brother-in-law's shell company was frozen. His house was going to be seized. His career was not just over. It was obliterated. 6 months later, he taught CPR certification courses at Wake Technical Community College for $14.50 an hour. He worked Tuesday and Thursday evenings in a fluorescent-lit classroom with high school students and adult career changers learning chest compressions on plastic mannequins. He was nobody there. Nobody important. Nobody with power. He was just a man who could demonstrate the correct hand placement over a heart that didn't have one, talking about compression rates and airway management to people who didn't care who he was. It was, in its own way, the most devastating punishment imaginable. Not prison. Not bankruptcy. Just the complete erasure of importance, the grinding realization that he had been building an empire on sand, and the sand had never been as solid as he'd thought. Katie stood in dress uniform at Camp Lejeune on a Tuesday morning in May. It was the first time she'd worn it in 5 years. The fabric was crisp, almost stiff with newness, and her ribbons were arranged in order of precedence like medals on a general's chest. Colonel Brennan stood beside her. His son stood beside his father in a wheelchair, a blue polo shirt and khaki pants, his breathing steady and strong now that he was seeing the specialist Katie had fought for. The boy was holding the worn combat boots on his lap like they were made of gold. The Secretary of the Navy was there. The commendation was being presented at a small ceremony in the base hospital, and Katie accepted it with the same quiet composure she'd used to accept every difficult thing in her life, with steady hands and eyes that had learned to hold tears in a place where they couldn't fall. The citation read her name. It read her rank. It read the word valorous and the phrase exemplary service, and when it was over and the photograph was taken with the secretary shaking her hand, she stood at perfect attention and did not cry. She cried later, alone in her apartment, holding the commendation against her chest like it was a person who could hug her back. She cried because she was allowed to cry now. She cried because the invisibility was over and she was going to have to figure out who she was without it. She cried because her sister had flown in from Seattle and was sitting on her couch right now, and Katie had finally told her everything, the Marjah deployment, the deaths, the reason she'd walked away, the panic attacks at 3 a.m., the way the sound of helicopters made her hands shake, the 12 years of trying to disappear into a job where she could help people without anyone asking her to explain herself. Her sister had hugged her for a very long time. She had not let go. The traveling combat medic from Act 2 was at the ceremony. The SEAL team leader was there. The refugee translator from Marjah, the former Taliban fighter who'd been injured in a car accident the day Katie saved Colonel Brennan's son, was sitting in the front row. He'd pointed at Katie in that hallway and shouted her call sign, Shadow 6, and the entire hospital had gone silent. He'd survived because she'd stayed with him when she could have left. He was in America now, a translator for the Department of Defense, and he'd written a letter to the Secretary of the Navy that said, "This woman saved my life and my brother's lives many times." She did not ask for recognition. She did not ask for thanks. She just kept working. Please tell her that we are alive because she chose to remember us. The Secretary had read that letter aloud at the ceremony. Katie visited Colonel Brennan's son at his follow-up appointment 3 weeks later at the new pediatric practice where she'd been offered the position of head of pediatric nursing. Marcus was walking with a walker, slow, determined steps like a soldier learning to move again. His breathing was strong. His color was good. His future, which had been carefully constrained by phantom billing codes and a cardiologist who existed only on paper, was now open in front of him like a country he could explore. "Miss Katie, my dad says you're a warrior," Marcus said, looking up at her with the particular intensity of children who somehow already understand the weight of things. Katie knelt to his eye level and looked directly into his eyes. Warriors come in all forms, she said quietly. Your dad is right, but not just about me. You fight every day. So does your father, fighting for you. She touched his hand, the same hand she'd held steady during his crisis, the same hand that was growing stronger now. Your body is learning something very important. Every step you take is a battle you're winning. She stood and looked out the window at the waiting room beyond the glass, other families sitting with other children, some of them sick, some of them scared, all of them hoping that someone would see them, really see them, and fight for them the way Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez fought for everyone who couldn't fight for themselves. This is what she'd been invisible for. This moment. This purpose. The quiet strength of someone who'd seen the worst and chose to give the most. Not because anyone was watching. Because people needed her to. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please hit like and subscribe to see more stories like this one. And comment below, what would you do if you held a secret that could change everything?